All right, well, welcome back to lesson number 5 of our series called The History of Idolatry. I want to ask you as we start this lesson, are you upset with how often God and the evidence of God is simply ignored in this world? Do you find it fascinating to find what great evidence there is in this world for God, for Jesus, and for the Bible? You probably have lots of lessons you've done. Perhaps you haven't seen evidence like we're dealing with in this series of lessons. What started out as a quest to kind of discover from a biblical standpoint, when did men begin to reject Yahweh and create their own gods? A quest to find out when did that happen? A quest to find out how these gods came about has turned into a series of lessons that really show the evidence for God and for these biblical stories in the book of Genesis. So last time we talked about the flood. And one of the key stories of the Bible is this worldwide flood in which so many critics don't want to admit that there was a flood. Either they ignore it altogether, they deny it altogether, or they try to minimize it into some small local flood, but definitely not a worldwide flood. Well, then why are these pagan nations who do not worship the one true God, Yahweh, why do they have these stories that they have verbalized to their descendants, that they have written down about this worldwide flood? So many of those stories that match in detail with the biblical story in the book of Genesis. Why is that? Well, that's what we dealt with in lesson number 4. And if you didn't catch that, I encourage you to go back to lesson 4 and watch that. It is incredible evidence that so many don't want to deal with, so many don't just want to deny. But in lesson number 5, we're going to deal with another evidence that I believe shows that even though the pagans rejected Yahweh, that they have a connection back to Noah and the flood and everything that Noah tried to do with his family. So we're going to talk about that even though the pagans rejected Yahweh and developed what we call polytheism, the worship of many gods, not just one, but multiple gods, that they still kept because of their past, because of what they were taught. Right? It's hard to overcome your past sometimes. They still had a concept of monotheism. In other words, even among their own gods, they still held to one true, supreme, chief deity. And we have to ask the question, why all these nations that worship these multiple gods, why do they all have this one chief, supreme, ruling God? Well, we know that there's really only 2 timelines when it comes to the history of man. And we're going to take a look and ask which of those timelines answers the evidence that we're going to look at in lesson 5 the best. So, as we talk about pagans and monotheism, let's talk a little bit about our premise here. So, we talked about biblical timelines. Well, here is what I believe is the biblical timeline, the biblical answer as to where all this idolatry and where the pagans came from and when. And of course we know that Noah wanted to teach his children about monotheism and about Yahweh. But at some point, about 100 years after the flood, according to Genesis 10, the Tower of Babel is that story that shows that they decide to reject Yahweh and make a name for themselves. And so because of God's reaction to that, as men are confused in their language and scattered abroad, different nations are formed eventually, and idolatry explodes. As we talked about, they are all different, but they're all the same. Instead of monotheism, they choose polytheism. But yet, as we're going to see in this lesson, they maintain this concept, even though they're polytheistic, of monotheism. One supreme ruling God among all the gods. So, we ask ourselves, would that be something that we would expect? That type of connection going all the way back to Noah and his sons, is that the type of evidence we would expect given this timeline? And the answer to that is yes. Because that's where they came from. That's their heritage. That's their past and what they were taught. But here's our premise. That even though Noah's descendants turned away from God to idols, the knowledge and the worship of Yahweh crept into their pagan religion. It was, whether intentional or unintentional, it crept into their mythology of their gods, the stories of their gods and so forth. And that's what we're going to see in this lesson. So let's compare that with the evolutionary / atheistic timeline, right? We got to get rid of Noah's Ark there because they don't believe in a flood. They've rejected that story. And a question I always ask, they rejected that because of the evidence or the content? Is there really the evidence to get rid of Noah and the flood and all that? Or is the rejection of that story based on the content of the book it's contained in? And I would say that the rejection of that is not the evidence. The evidence is overwhelming, as we saw in Lesson 4, but it's because of the content of the Bible. So we got rid of the flood, and what do we have? Well, we have these millions of years of evolution. But man didn't evolve in one place, in one location. No, what happens is they're scattered among the continents, in the different lands, and so they evolve separate from one another. And that's why we have men that have so much different appearances. Natural selection selected what would be the best traits, the best characteristics for man in those different areas, those different continents. And so we have men with light skin versus men with dark skin. Men with straight hair versus curly hair, and we can go on and on and on. And so as they evolve scattered from one another in the ancient times, out of these basically eventually comes their nations and the formation of culture and the formation of their own religion. And when you understand the separation there, it seems to me reasonable, given this timeline, that there should be no to very little connection between these groups. There should be very little commonality. They're evolving separate from one another. And so we should see different concepts and different types of religion, but that's not what we see at all. We see a very uniform connection. Like I said, these pagan nations are all different, but when you really look at it, they're all the same. Especially when it comes to religion. So which timeline, when we look at this concept that these pagan nations keep a system of monotheism, one chief deity, which timeline answers that question, why is that? Is that something we would expect given the evolutionary timeline? And the answer to that is no. That wouldn't be the best answer. That's not what we would expect. We would expect differences among these people in the ancient times. So let's talk a little bit about pagan history connecting to the Bible. This comes from Keith Sisman in his book, The Devil's Door, in which we quote him saying, both early accounts of the pagan world and modern archaeology, science, confirm a knowledge of God amongst the ancients. World history has a wonderful array of information going back to Noah, his sons, and their sons. So do you see what he is concluding in his research? He is saying that when you look at pagan history, you look at their stories, their accounts, and then you combine that with modern archaeology, what you have is a confirmation that these pagan nations, what? They had a knowledge of Yahweh. A knowledge of God amongst the ancients. And that's exactly what you expect given the biblical timeline, not the evolutionary timeline. He goes on to say that when you look at world history, you have this wonderful array of information bringing these pagan nations all the way back to Noah and his sons. And that's exactly what we're talking about in this series of the history of idolatry. So let's talk about pagan history connecting to the Bible. There's a problem. What's that problem? The problem isn't evidence. The problem is this. Again, this is quoting from Sisman. He says, the information has been hidden and even denied by secularist historians. In other words, he's saying they don't want you to know this stuff. And so they ignore it. They act like it doesn't exist. And it's much like we talked about in Lesson 4, this idea of evolution. We're told over and over that when you start talking about God, you've stepped out of the realm of science. Well, not necessarily. Because in the realm of science, it is completely logical and correct to observe something in this world and to theorize that this is so complex that this had to have intelligence to design it. That's a logical and correct conclusion in the scientific world. There's lots of times that conclusion is made, except when you're talking about the origins of humanity, the origins of this world. We're told, no, that is not a correct scientific investigation. And why is that? Again, I ask you that question. Is it because of the evidence or the content of the Bible? You see, they don't want to go there because if they allow for the intelligent design conclusion, they open that door, they know that this bigger door called God, the Creator, is going to open up. And they don't want that. And it's the same regard as Sisman is saying here. They hide this information because they don't want you to have any evidence to think that the Bible does exist, that God does exist and the Bible is true, that there's a connection between pagan history and the Bible. George Stanley Faber, in his book, The Origins of Pagan Idolatry, writes this: at some point in ancient time, the heathen system became materialistic and God was forgotten. There was that knowledge of God, but eventually he was forgotten. It went away. But here's the premise of this lesson. Went away completely? No, not completely. That some of these things, like the flood, like monotheism, like the Trinity, those concepts and those stories continued on even in their pagan religion. And that's what our premise is in these series. Okay? So, What's the evidence of this? Well, let's take a look at, and this comes from Sisman's book. He quotes from this. He looks at this Chinese author, and that's his name there. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. But here's this Chinese author in the 6th century BC. We're talking ancient time, right? Who describes a particular Chinese god. All right, let's take a look at this description of this Chinese god. He's described as existing before time, unable to be expressed by mere words, unable to be named. He is described as being eternal, infinite, complete, omnipresent, beyond this world, before the beginning of time, and self-existing. Now I want you to notice that. This is a group that developed in the Chinese area, China area, all the way to the 6th century BC. They have this God, and look at how he's described. I don't know about you, but that sounds a lot like Yahweh, doesn't it? Now, is this a single incident, just a coincidence? Well, let's now take a look from E. Wallace Budge and his writings, The Gods of the Egyptians. Let's talk about a god that is described here as an Egyptian god. He's described in this way: the creator of all things. He created all things, not just created all things, he created all things from what? His mouth. He spoke it, and it came into existence. He is described as existing before heaven and earth. Notice those two concepts are mentioned here. Heaven and earth by the Egyptian pagans. Isn't that interesting? Existing before the creation of all things. Number 5, the deity that raised creation from the primeval abyss, from a state of non-being. Again, I ask you, does that not sound exactly like Genesis chapter 1? There was nothing. It was a state of non-being, and what? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And there was what? It was formless and void. It was like a primeval abyss. And where he created, he raised creation from that nothingness. I mean, just look at that description. We're talking about two different pagan people. And yet they have a God that sounds very much like Yahweh. Which of the timelines is going to best explain why that might be? Let's talk about the knowledge of one God. J. Wilkinson, in his book, The Manners and Customs of the Ancient Egyptians, writes this. He says, in the early ages of mankind, the existence of a sole omnipotent deity who created all things seems to have been the universal belief, and tradition taught men the same notions on this subject. Do you see what he's saying there? He's saying that there is this evidence that from the early ages of mankind, there was a knowledge of a God, a sole deity, who was omnipotent. Not only that, but he was the creator of all things. And he says that God, the knowledge of that God, was a universal belief in the ancient times. That's exactly what we're talking about in this lesson, in this series. Which timeline would account for that being true? That's what I'm asking you in this lesson. Let's talk about Egyptian hieroglyphics, okay? Right, the ancient word pictures, if you would, language that came out of these pictures. What is the evidence that can be found in that? Well, author and expert F. Lenormant talks about the historian Herodotus, an Egyptian historian, living back in 484 to 425 BC. He says Herodotus affirmed that the Egyptians of the Thebes recognized a single deity. And not only that, this God had no beginning and no end of days. Why do we have not just a chief deity, but a God that is described above all of the gods with the same description we have come to know of Yahweh? How will we account for that given these two different timelines? Again, sticking with Lenormant, he says of this God, He is the sole progenitor in heaven and earth. There's those two concepts again. And that He Himself is not begotten, that He is the sole God existing in truth, begotten of Himself, who exists from the beginning, who made all things and was not Himself created. Just look at that description. These are the pagans of Egypt. And this is a God that they worship, that they hold up, and this is how they describe Him. This is from Herodotus. So let's talk a little bit about polytheism, created from God's attributes. Now, this is a theory that's brought out by Lenormant, and it's a little tricky. I'm not saying that this absolutely is true, but I think it's an interesting theory. How you go from one God to many gods. So I'm going to read this and then I'll kind of explain what he's talking about. Okay? He says the idea of God became confused with the manifestations of His power, His attributes, and qualities, which were personified as a crowd of secondary agents arranged in a hierarchical order, cooperating in the general organization of the world and in the preservation of created beings. In this way, polytheism was formed, which in the truth and peculiarity of its symbols ended by embracing the whole of nature. So what I think he's talking about there is his theory is you have Yahweh, you have monotheism, you have this one God. How do we get all these multiple gods? Well, at least starts off with that we know Yahweh has what? Many different attributes, many different characteristics. He's eternal. He is the creator. He is omnipotent. He is omnipresent. And we could go on and on and on. And what he is saying is that it appears that the pagans eventually took those attributes and kind of made them into different gods and formed a hierarchy and then attached those gods, which were really nothing more than the attributes or the powers of God, to what? Function as needed into the ancient world. Again, I find that fascinating. I can see that exact thing happen among pagans. I could see that happening and why we go from one to many gods. So one of the best passages, probably the best passage, that describes the origin of idolatry is Romans chapter 1, verse 21 and 23, through 23. And let's take a look at this, because it's exactly what we're talking about, the evidence of what we see. Paul writes in Romans 1:21, "For even though they knew God," let me stop there. Here's these idolaters who reject Yahweh and go to their own gods. What's this? They knew God. Now, is that something we would expect from the evolutionary timeline? No. But that's exactly what we're talking about and bringing out in the biblical timeline. So, even though they knew God, he goes on to say, they did not honor him as God or give thanks. But, and I'll add this, by their own choice, they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image. For an image in the form of corruptible man and of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. And that's exactly the evidence we see in the ancient world. That they knew God, but they rejected him. Instead of worshiping the Creator, they decided to worship the creature. And so they made an image in the form and the likeness of man. They made an image in the form and the likeness of birds and animals, and they worshiped them. And we did in previous lessons talk about why that was. Why were they tempted to do that? Why was that so attractive to them? But I want you to really pay attention that Paul says of the pagans, they knew God. And that's exactly the evidence we see that we've been looking at. Let's take a look at this passage as well. Acts chapter 17, 23 and 24. If you can't remember that exactly, this is where Paul goes into Athens. And he starts preaching about Jesus and the resurrection and the gospel. And they bring him to Mars Hill. And previously to this, Paul had been traveling about Athens, and he was noticing how religious they were. They were dedicated to idolatry. They had an altar and a temple to everything. In fact, they had an altar which had the inscription, "To an unknown God." Just in case they missed one God and didn't know who he was, they still wanted to worship him. And Paul latches onto that. And let's take a look at what he says. He says, "For while I was passing through and examining the object of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you.'" So Paul is going to insert Yahweh in there. What a clever way to introduce Yahweh to them. You've already been worshiping him, but now I'm going to identify him. Your John Doe deity, I'm going to tell you who he is. And so look at what he says. Look at how he introduces God. "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands." One of the things I want you to notice in this is, how does he introduce God? He introduces God as the God of creation. He's the God that created all things. And I want you to notice, they don't stop listening. They don't got a problem with that. They keep listening. They're intrigued by this. And so Paul's point is, but this God that created everything, and therefore what? He is beyond all these other gods. He's above all these other gods. He's different than them. He's not like these other gods. He doesn't dwell in temples made with hands. He's not served with human hands. He's beyond that. And what a brilliant way for Paul to bring Yahweh into the conversation. But notice how he describes him. As the God that creates the world. That's how he introduces Yahweh to the pagans. It's not until he starts talking about the resurrection that they start closing their ears. So let's talk about this concept of from one God to many. John Gardner Wilkinson states that at the time the earth was divided. Now he looks at this a little bit differently than I do, but I insert here my belief. All right, he says the evidence of the world being divided. My belief is that this is going back to Babel, where man was divided and scattered, right? But he says this. He states at the time the earth was divided, men deviated from the rational adoration of the only true God to their own man-made idols. And that's exactly the premise that we've been looking at in the series. And he says that's exactly what the evidence shows. That when it was divided, when men were scattered, that's when we start to see them turning away from Yahweh and worshiping their own made idols. So, you say to me, okay, well that's all fine and good. You're just throwing out all of these quotes and so forth, okay? But how can I really know that this is accurate, this is true? Well, this is well documented in the Bible as well. And what I mean by that is, the Bible documents that these pagan nations, even though they're polytheistic, had a chief supreme deity. Let's take a look at some of these examples for you. For example, Numbers 22, verse 41. We all remember the story of Balaam. We know the story of Balaam, right? Because his donkey talks. And that's a story you can't forget. But even before that happens, what happens is Balak is trying to entice Balaam to curse Israel. So, according to Numbers 22:41, then it came about in the morning that Balak took Balaam and brought him up to the high places of Baal. What do you notice about Baal? It's singular. It's not plural. Why did he bring him up to the high places of Baal? Who's this Baal? Well, according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, Baal is the supreme fertility god of the Canaanites. According to Fawcett and his Bible dictionary, Baal is the chief male deity, as Ashereth is the chief female deity, the chief goddess of the Canaanites and the Phoenicians. And when you talk about these chief deities, you read about Baal all the time. You don't read about all the other gods often. It's Baal this and the Asherah this. Why do they have this chief supreme god? We'll talk a little bit in another lesson about the formation of female deities as well, which is very different than what we see in the Bible, where God is always talked about in terms of the masculine gender. That's another lesson. But I want you to notice they have a chief deity. Judges 16:23. Now the lords of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to all their gods? No. To Dagon, their god. And to rejoice, for they said, our God. Notice that. Our God, not God's. Our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And so I want you to notice that when they got a hold of Samson, they gave all the credit, not to all their God, but to their chief deity, to Dagon. And as you read about the Philistines, Dagon's pretty much the only god you read about. And they refer to him as their God. He's our God. It's a concept of monotheism. So who is this Dagon? According to Easton, the national god of the Philistines. Continuing on. So here's this question. What did pagans do when they gained the knowledge of Yahweh? And so in other words, sometimes these pagans, especially these pagan kings, come in contact with God through God's characters, God's people. For example, Daniel. So what did they do when they came into the knowledge of Yahweh? Well, let's look at Daniel chapter 2. and verse 47. The king answered Daniel and said, "Surely your God is a God of gods, and a Lord of kings, and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery." You see, what we see in these pagan kings is when they encounter Yahweh, number one, they recognize He is supreme to what their gods can do. But they don't give up their gods. But they have absolutely no problem taking Yahweh and putting Him as like the chief deity. Isn't that an interesting concept? No problem with this concept of monotheism. It doesn't interfere with their polytheism. But why do they have that concept? Why do they maintain that concept? Daniel 3:26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out. You're servants of the Most High God, and come here." Here the king was really worried. But when he saw that they didn't get burned up in this fire that killed others, just because they came too close to the heat of it, look at what he declares. He says, "You are servants of," what? "Your God?" No. "The Most High God." Now, does that mean they always maintain that concept of Yahweh? No. They're pagans. But notice they have no problem with that idea of a supreme, ruling deity. Again, why is that? What timeline would be that? Let me read a couple passages here along these lines. Daniel chapter 6, verse 25. This is the King Darius. Then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land. "May your peace abound," he writes. "I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For He is the living God." Look at this. "He is the living God and enduring forever. And His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and His dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He also has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions." Let me read as well from 2 Kings chapter 5. This is the story of a pagan man with leprosy who his gods can't heal him. But he goes down to the prophet of Yahweh. And at first he doesn't like what he hears. But eventually he does what the prophet tells him, and he is cleansed. And in fact, he is so impressed. Look at what happens in 2 Kings chapter 5. I will get there in just a second here. Chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. As he talks to the man of God. Naaman said, "If not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules load of earth. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offerings, nor will he sacrifice to other gods," plural, "but to the Lord. In this matter may the Lord pardon your servant when my master goes into the house of Rimmon to worship there. And the master, and he leans on my hand, and I bow myself in the house of Rimmon. And when I bow myself in the house of Rimmon, the Lord pardon your servant in this manner." Do you see what he's doing here? He's saying, listen, I've got to go back home, and what? I'm not going to worship any other gods. But there's going to be this time where I got to go into the house of Rimmon. Why? He's our chief deity. He's our God. He's the supreme God. And I'm going to be expected to bow down. But I want you to know, even though I bow down, I am not worshiping Him. I am worshiping Yahweh. He had no problem with the concept of monotheism. He just switched it from Rimmon to the one true God, Yahweh. So, as we close, which answer explains this the best? Is it the evolutionary timeline? I don't think so. I'm not saying it's not possible, but everything I see goes back to this timeline. I think this is a better answer. People that came out of Noah's family and were taught monotheism, and even though they strayed from it, it crept into their religion. And we see evidence in history, and we see evidence as well in the Bible for all of this. It's an evidence for God and for these stories of Genesis. But people don't want you to know about this evidence because they don't want to open that door for God. It's about a rejection, not based on evidence, but based on content. And I hope you can see that. And so that's our lesson. So glad that you were able to join us. I don't have our information up here on this screen, but you can go back to any of our other videos and you could see it. And we'd love to sit down and study God's Word with you. Not just this history stuff and this evidence stuff, but truly, what is Jesus Christ's plan for you? To study the New Testament, the plan of salvation, to talk about what is the church as Jesus Christ built it. I hope to see you in lesson number 6. Thank you so much for joining us.